Hannah Brewer's gaze met her grieving mother-in-law's across the bustling courtroom, and a slow, deliberate smirk spread across her lips, a chilling display of unwavering self-assurance. She had meticulously woven a web of deceit so intricate, so impenetrable, that she genuinely believed herself untouchable, convinced that the only witness who could dismantle her alibi lay eternally silenced beneath 6 feet of earth. Yet, the voice poised to shatter her perfectly crafted facade would emerge from a realm she considered beyond the grave, a voice she was certain she had witnessed, taking its last, gasping breath on the blood-stained kitchen floor. In Northwood Hills, Hannah Brewer was revered as an embodiment of grace and unwavering commitment. As a second-grade teacher, her classroom was a sanctuary of creativity and warmth. She meticulously organized the annual charity bake sale, generously volunteered at the local animal shelter, and maintained a garden that was the envy of every neighbor. Her life with her husband, Matthew, a kind-hearted architect, and their 7-year-old son, Leo, was universally perceived as the epitome of suburban perfection, a real-life fairy tale woven with shared aspirations and mutual respect. Their lovingly restored colonial home, with its sprawling oak tree dominating the front yard, was a frequent gathering place for friends and family, perpetually filled with laughter and the comforting aroma of Hannah's celebrated apple pie. To the outside world, their bond seemed unbreakable, a testament to 14 years of what appeared to be steadfast love and partnership. This widespread perception made the events of their 15th wedding anniversary all the more unfathomable, transforming a day of joyous celebration into a night of unimaginable terror. Matthew had meticulously planned a surprise dinner, adorning the house with candles and filling it with the gentle melody of their wedding song. He presented Hannah with a delicate locket, intricately engraved with their initials. But beneath Hannah's appreciative smiles and tender kisses, a cold resolve was solidifying, a plan meticulously cultivated in the hidden, shadowy corners of a life no one suspected she was leading. As their son slept soundly upstairs and with the last of the champagne poured, Hannah's meticulously crafted facade finally crumbled, not in a burst of fury, but with the cold, measured precision of a predator who had patiently awaited the opportune moment to strike. She had decided that this anniversary would not mark another year of marriage, but rather its brutal, bloody conclusion. The betrayal was absolute, a shocking act of violence that defied all logic and comprehension for those who believed they truly knew this woman. With Matthew's back turned, his heart overflowing from an evening celebrating their life together, Hannah acted with a savagery utterly alien to the gentle schoolteacher persona she had so brilliantly perfected over the years. The assault was swift and brutal, a devastating ambush in the very sanctuary where they had built their family and shared their most intimate moments. She left him on their dining room's gleaming hardwood floor, surrounded by the remnants of their anniversary celebration, convinced that her final, violent act had permanently erased the man who stood in the way of her desired new beginning. In the aftermath, as Matthew lay silent and motionless, Hannah moved with unsettling calm, her thoughts already shifting from the gruesome reality of her actions to the next phase of her elaborate deception. She meticulously altered the scene, staging a robbery gone wrong, with a composure that spoke of a profound and terrifying detachment from her husband's humanity and the sanctity of their shared life. Her objective was not merely to end a man's life, but to extinguish an entire existence. To obliterate the past so she could step into a future she had secretly been cultivating with another person. A future financed by the life insurance policy she had discreetly verified just 3 days prior. The love story of Hannah and Matthew Brewer was not simply over. It was revealed to be a profound fabrication. Its final brutal chapter was penned in blood by the one person he had trusted above all others. The 911 call came just past 11 o'clock that night. The voice on the other end was frantic, breathless, and convincingly hysterical. Hannah Brewer, the loving wife, frantically screamed to the dispatcher about a break-in, a masked intruder, and finding her husband unconscious in a pool of blood. She played the part of the distraught victim flawlessly, her panicked cries mirroring the genuine terror of anyone who had just endured such an ordeal. The first responders arriving at the scene discovered a woman in shock, wrapped in a blanket on her neighbor's porch, while paramedics valiantly worked on her husband. They witnessed a community rallying around one of their own, a beloved teacher whose perfect world had just been shattered by a random act of violence. Not a single soul suspected that the monster was the very person who had made the call. Investigators initially approached the case as a straightforward home invasion, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence in a world where violence can infiltrate even the safest havens. They canvassed the neighborhood, collected preliminary evidence, and took Hannah's statement, meticulously documenting her tearful, fragmented account of the evening's horrific events. She spoke of a shadowy figure, a deep voice, and the paralyzing fear that had gripped her as she hid in a closet, listening to the sounds of a struggle. Her performance was masterful, every detail meticulously crafted to elicit sympathy and deflect suspicion far away from herself. The detectives, seasoned and cynical, felt a pang of pity for the young widow, a woman whose life had been irrevocably shattered by an act of senseless brutality. However, as the initial shock subsided and the forensic teams commenced their meticulous work, subtle inconsistencies began to surface, small threads that, if tugged, threatened to completely unravel Hannah's meticulously fabricated narrative. The alleged point of entry showed no signs of forced entry, and the house, while disturbed, did not appear as if it had been ransacked for valuables by a panicked burglar. The family dog, renowned for its loud and protective nature, had remained completely silent throughout the entire alleged ordeal, a detail that struck the lead detective as particularly peculiar. Individually, these were minor points, easily dismissed, but collectively they formed a quiet chorus of doubt in the investigators' minds, a dissonance that sharply contrasted with the meticulously crafted story of a grieving widow. The true nature of Hannah Brewer, the loving wife and dedicated teacher, remained concealed behind a mask of sorrow, a carefully constructed illusion she had spent years perfecting. Friends and family surrounded her, bringing casseroles and offering tearful condolences, all completely unaware of the chilling truth lurking beneath the surface. They mourned Matthew's loss alongside her, sharing memories of his kindness and generosity, while Hannah absorbed their sympathy like a sponge, using their grief to fortify her own lies. She was the central figure in a tragedy of her own making, the author and star of a horrific play, and for now, her audience remained utterly captivated by her award-winning performance. In the interrogation room, under the stark hum of fluorescent lights, Hannah Brewer's performance continued, but the audience had changed. Detectives Miles Corbin and Jessica Reyes were not grief-stricken neighbors. They were seasoned investigators with a combined 30 years of experience in deciphering the subtle language of deception. They began the interview gently, offering condolences and allowing Hannah to recount her story for the third time, meticulously observing her every move and listening to every carefully chosen word. She spoke of her profound love for Matthew, their shared plans for the future, and the monstrous phantom who had stolen it all away from them, her voice cracking at precisely the right moments. She was constructing a fortress of lies, brick by painful brick, convinced of its impenetrable strength. But the detectives arrived armed with more than just questions. They possessed the initial forensic reports and a timeline that was becoming increasingly problematic for Hannah's version of events. Detective Corbin, in his calm, methodical voice, began to highlight the inconsistencies, not as outright accusations, but as points of confusion he hoped she could clarify. He inquired about the unforced window, the silent dog, and the curious absence of any foreign DNA at the scene, presenting each piece of contradictory evidence as a simple puzzle piece that simply didn't fit. With each question, a flicker of irritation would cross Hannah's face, a momentary crack in her sorrowful facade, before it was quickly concealed by another wave of manufactured grief and confusion. The true extent of her contempt for their intelligence became apparent when she began to elaborate on her lies, adding superfluous new details in an attempt to make her narrative seem more plausible. She invented a second intruder, described a getaway car she couldn't possibly have seen from her hiding place, and even suggested a motive connected to Matthew's work that she knew to be entirely false. It was a classic strategy of a pathological liar, over-explaining and over-embellishing, driven by a narcissistic belief that she was intellectually superior to everyone in the room and could weave a reality more convincing than the truth. She wasn't merely lying to protect herself. She was performing an act of intellectual condescension, treating the detectives as a captive audience for her sordid fiction. The turning point in the interrogation arrived not with a shouted accusation, but with a quiet, simple presentation of a single photograph. Detective Reyes slid a picture across the table, revealing Matthew in his hospital bed, alive but in a deep coma. His survival, a closely guarded secret. For the first time, Hannah's composure shattered completely, her meticulously constructed world collapsing in an instant as she stared at the image of the man she was certain she had killed. The mask of the grieving widow shattered, revealing a flicker of raw, unadulterated fury, a rage not aimed at an intruder, but at the man who had inexplicably survived, her face contorting into a sneer of disbelief and profound frustration. When her confession finally emerged, it wasn't a cascade of penitent tears, but a deluge of indignant self-pity and virulent accusation. She didn't admit to murder. Instead, she framed herself as a casualty of a loveless marriage, a martyr propelled to her actions by Matthew's purported indifference and lack of drive. She cast herself as the tragic heroine in a romantic saga, a woman who, having discovered a new, more deserving love, was compelled to take drastic measures to escape her suffocating existence. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the horror she had inflicted, only an unsettling and profound conviction in her own righteousness, a chilling, sociopathic justification for an act of pure, self-serving malevolence. The arrest itself unfolded quietly, a stark contrast to the brutal chaos of the crime scene and the dramatic emotional intensity of the interrogation room. As Hannah Brewer was escorted from the precinct in handcuffs, she didn't appear monstrous, but rather like the woman everyone had always known, a bewildered, terrified teacher ensnared in a living nightmare. She had already begun to recalibrate her narrative, transitioning from the heartbroken widow to the unjustly accused wife, a new role she would embody with the same theatrical dedication. Even as the cold steel clicked around her wrists, she exuded confidence, convinced this was merely a temporary setback, a misunderstanding she could effortlessly charm her way out of before a sympathetic jury. Yet, the path to that jury would be paved with the very evidence she believed did not exist. The detectives possessed her confession, but it was one riddled with self-serving falsehoods and a complete absence of accountability. They understood that her conviction would not hinge on her words, but on the slow, meticulous dismantling of the perfect life she had presented to the world. They would need to delve into her financial records, her communications, her clandestine existence, and expose the decay that had festered beneath the surface of the idyllic Brewer family home for years. The investigation was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Hannah, seated in the back of the squad car, gazed out at the passing streetlights, a subtle, defiant smile gracing her lips. She felt a surge of relief, a strange and twisted liberation from the life she had so desperately yearned to escape. She was no longer merely a wife and mother. She was at the epicenter of a dramatic, high-stakes narrative, an intriguing figure of both tragedy and intrigue. In her mind, the trial would be her stage, the ultimate platform to recount her version of events and win the public's adoration and empathy. She was utterly oblivious to the grim reality of her situation, shielded from the repercussions of her actions by an impenetrable wall of narcissism. The public narrative of Hannah Brewer, the unjustly accused teacher and grieving wife, began to solidify within hours of her arrest. Her stunned colleagues and friends rallied to her defense, portraying her as a gentle soul incapable of violence, a woman devoted to her family and her students. They painted a picture of a perfect marriage, citing frequent public displays of affection and the loving family photos that adorned her social media pages. This narrative, fueled by genuine shock and an unwavering belief in the woman they thought they knew, constructed a formidable barrier of public sympathy that prosecutors knew they would have to systematically dismantle, piece by methodical piece. Behind the scenes, however, a vastly different image of Hannah was gradually emerging, one brushstroke at a time, from the digital and financial trails she had left behind. Investigators, armed with search warrants, delved into the couple's bank accounts, credit card statements, and loan applications. What they uncovered was not a partnership, but a parasitic relationship. For years, Hannah had been systematically siphoning their joint finances, opening clandestine credit cards in Matthew's name, and forging his signature on documents to secure personal loans she had no intention of repaying. The The money, totaling over $100,000, had vanished without a trace, spent on luxury items, lavish trips, and expensive gifts that Matthew had never seen. The investigation brought to light the underlying motive for this financial depletion: a secret second life. Detectives discovered a hidden email account and a burner phone Hannah had used to communicate with her lover, a man she had been seeing for over 2 years. The messages laid bare the depth of her deception, replete with fervent declarations of love and elaborate plans for their shared future, a future entirely contingent on her freedom from Matthew. She had promised her lover a life of affluence and adventure, weaving a tapestry of lies about a substantial inheritance she was due to receive, a convenient fiction to account for the sudden influx of cash she anticipated from Matthew's life insurance policy. She wasn't merely cheating on her husband. She was orchestrating a complete replacement of her current life with a new one built upon a foundation of theft and deceit. This startling revelation cast the crime in an even more sinister light. It was not a spontaneous act of passion, but the calculated final step in a long-term scheme, where her husband was simply an obstacle to be eliminated. Financial pressure had been mounting, with collection agencies initiating calls and the secret loans on the brink of default. Hannah was running out of time, and Matthew's anniversary surprise had unwittingly provided the perfect opportunity to execute her brutal exit strategy. The attack was an act of financial preservation, a cold-blooded transaction designed to resolve her debt problem and fund her escape into a fantasy life, with her husband's demise being the cost of doing business. The evidence utterly transformed the prosecution's understanding of the case, shifting the focus from a domestic dispute to a cold, premeditated crime fueled by pure, unadulterated greed. They now possessed a clear and compelling motive that irrevocably shattered the defense's narrative of a loving but troubled marriage. Hannah Brewer was not a victim. She was a predator who had viewed her kind, trusting husband as nothing more than a financial instrument, a resource to be exploited and then discarded when he was no longer useful. The image of the dedicated teacher and loving wife was a meticulously maintained facade for a ruthless con artist and a cold-blooded killer. The weight of this new evidence was immense, a silent testament to the vast chasm between Hannah's public persona and her private reality. Investigators uncovered receipts for expensive hotel stays booked while she was supposedly at teaching conferences, and records of jewelry purchases for her lover, made with money pilfered from their son's college fund. Each discovery was another layer of betrayal, another irrefutable piece of proof that the woman Matthew Brewer had loved and trusted was a complete fabrication, a hollow shell of a person devoid of empathy or conscience. Her entire life was a performance, and the curtain was finally being drawn back to reveal the darkness lurking backstage. As Hannah sat in her jail cell, consulting with her defense attorney, she remained blissfully unaware of the digital and paper trail that was inexorably closing in on her. She continued to assert her innocence, meticulously crafting a new narrative in which she was the victim of a vindictive and incompetent police investigation. She was preparing for a battle of charisma and emotion in the courtroom, confident that her tears and heartfelt testimony would sway any jury. She had no inkling that the prosecution was preparing for a different kind of trial, one that would be fought not with words and emotions, but with the cold, hard, and undeniable language of numbers, dates, and receipts. The financial records told a story far more compelling than any tale Hannah could invent. A silent, damning narrative of greed, betrayal, and a chilling disregard for human life. The detectives had uncovered the why, the cold, calculating reason behind the savage attack on Matthew Brewer. Now, the prosecution's task was to present this story to a jury, to peel away the layers of deception and expose the heartless financial parasite who had been masquerading as a beloved member of their community for more than a decade. The stage was being set for a confrontation with the truth, and it was a truth from which Hannah would have no escape. In the months leading up to the trial, Hannah Brewer fully embraced her role as the misunderstood victim, a tragic figure caught in the crosshairs of a justice system desperate for a conviction. She granted carefully orchestrated interviews from jail to sympathetic local reporters, her voice trembling as she spoke of her undying love for her husband and her unwavering faith that the truth would ultimately set her free. Her performance was meticulously rehearsed, a symphony of feigned vulnerability and quiet dignity designed to manipulate public opinion and to potentially taint the jury pool. She understood the power of perception and was determined to win the war for hearts and minds before the trial even began. The pre-trial hearings offered the first glimpse of the real Hannah, the one who existed behind the mask of sorrow. In the sterile environment of the courtroom, away from the sympathetic gaze of television cameras, her demeanor notably shifted. She would often be observed smiling and casually chatting with her defense attorney, Stephen Carlson, only to have her face crumble into a mask of theatrical despair the moment she perceived the courtroom sketch artist looking her way. The stark, disorienting shifts between feigned indifference and theatrical agony profoundly disturbed the few onlookers present, unmistakably signaling a staged act rather than genuine sentiment. Her endeavors to simulate regret were so unconvincing they bordered on offensive, cheapening the profound suffering endured by Matthew's kin. During one session, as the prosecutor meticulously detailed the gravity of Matthew's injuries, Hannah produced a tissue, dabbing at her impeccably dry eyes, her shoulders shuddering with fabricated sobs that yielded no tears. It was a repulsive spectacle, a hollow charade of sorrow so patently false that it merely underscored her profound emotional detachment. She wasn't grieving her husband. She was merely portraying a mourner, and a woefully untalented one, when the stakes were truly consequential. The most revealing moment unfolded when the judge denied her bail request, deeming her a substantial flight risk given the revelations of her clandestine life and financial dealings. As the verdict was pronounced, Hannah's carefully maintained composure momentarily fractured, not into sorrow, but into a flash of petulant fury, her lips curling into a silent snarl. She cast a look of sheer venom at the prosecutor, Victoria Ramos, a gaze that conveyed not the apprehension of an innocent individual, but the indignation of a culpable one, whose machinations had been momentarily thwarted. It offered a fleeting yet potent glimpse into the arrogant, entitled persona who genuinely believed herself beyond the reach of consequences. Behind the scenes, her conduct was even more chilling. Her time in jail was not spent in introspection, but meticulously orchestrating her courtroom attire, demanding outfits that would project an image of softness, maternal warmth, and non-threat. She composed letters to her sympathizers, filling pages with self-pitying prose and veiled accusations against law enforcement and Matthew's family, casting herself as a martyr caught in a vast conspiracy. Her preoccupation centered entirely on superficial appearances and narrative manipulation, a clear indication that she viewed the impending trial not as a reckoning with justice, but as the paramount performance of her existence. Her defense attorney, Stephen Carlson, a seasoned public defender, found himself in an increasingly precarious situation. He was tasked with representing a client seemingly devoid of authentic emotion, whose primary concern was her public persona rather than the overwhelming evidence stacked against her. He counseled her to maintain silence, to project an aura of solemnity. Yet, Hannah, convinced of her own superior intellect and persuasive charm, disregarded his advice. She believed she could outwit everyone, that she could cry and sulk her way to an acquittal, a delusion her lawyer knew would likely shatter under the unforgiving scrutiny of cross-examination. The chasm between Hannah's public facade and her private reality widened with each passing day. The public perceived a heartbroken wife, while the prosecution saw a financial predator. Her acquaintances viewed a kind teacher, while investigators discerned a calculated killer who had meticulously orchestrated her husband's demise. This stark duality lay at the core of the case, the conflict between the convincing, amiable mask and the monstrous face concealed beneath. The prosecution's entire strategy hinged on their ability to tear away that mask before a jury of her peers. As the trial date neared, Hannah's confidence swelled. Buoyed by the supportive correspondence and the fawning local media coverage she had so adeptly cultivated, she dismissed the prosecutors as overzealous bureaucrats and the police as bumbling fools she had effortlessly outmaneuvered. Her narcissism created an impenetrable bubble, rendering her incapable of perceiving the ironclad cage of evidence relentlessly tightening around her. Her sickening performance of remorse was not merely a legal tactic. It was a testament to her fundamental conviction that she could manipulate reality itself, a belief poised for the ultimate test. The commencement of the trial, the State versus Hannah Brewer, was marked by a palpable tension that permeated every corner of the packed courtroom. On one side sat the prosecution, spearheaded by the shrewd and composed Victoria Ramos, her team meticulously organized with binders of evidence stacked neatly before them. Across the aisle sat Hannah, attired in a soft, pale blue sweater, her hair demurely pulled back, resembling less a defendant accused of attempted murder, and more a PTA mom who had taken a wrong turn. Her countenance expressed solemn fear, a carefully chosen guise for the occasion, and she occasionally cast glances toward the gallery where Matthew's family sat, her eyes conveying a silent, pre-rehearsed plea for empathy. After the jury was impaneled, Victoria Ramos approached the podium to deliver her opening statement, her presence commanding the room's undivided attention. She began not with an accusation or a chronological account of the crime, but with a simple, potent gesture to establish Matthew Brewer, the victim, as a tangible and real presence in the room. The large screens positioned for the jury flickered to life, not displaying gruesome crime scene photographs, but a short, vibrant video clip captured on Matthew's phone the day before the assault. In it, he was laughing, his face radiant with life and joy as he filmed his son, Leo, flying a kite in their sun-drenched backyard. A perfect snapshot of a life on the precipice of violent shattering. The video depicted a man deeply devoted to his family, his voice warm and affectionate as he called out to Hannah, who was momentarily visible in the background, smiling. He then turned the camera on himself, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he addressed his future self, expressing his excitement for their upcoming anniversary and the wonderful life he shared with his wife. 15 years, and I've never been happier, he declared, his voice imbued with a genuine, uncomplicated joy that was now almost unbearable to witness. The clip concluded, plunging the courtroom into a profound, heavy silence, the image of the smiling, living Matthew lingering in the air, a spectral presence at his own trial. Ramos allowed the silence to resonate for a moment before speaking, her voice clear and steady, devoid of theatrics. She described the man they had just seen on the screen, a loving husband and devoted father, a man whose trust had been perverted into a weapon against him. Then she methodically and chillingly recounted the crime, contrasting the beautiful life portrayed in the video with the brutal, cold-blooded violence that had transpired in the very same home merely 24 hours later. She asserted to the jury that the evidence would demonstrate this was not a home invasion, but an execution meticulously orchestrated by the one person he completely trusted, the woman smiling in the background of his final, joyous video. Throughout the opening statement, Hannah sat at the defense table, silently weeping into a tissue. It was yet another of her unconvincing performances, but this time its impact was diminished by the raw, authentic emotion of the video the jury had just experienced. Her calculated sorrow seemed hollow and artificial when juxtaposed with the genuine happiness of the man she had attempted to erase. Some jurors cast glances at her, their expressions inscrutable, while others kept their eyes fixed on Ramos, their faces hardened by the stark reality of the betrayal she described. When it came time for the defense, Stephen Carlson rose and painted a picture of a flawed, yet loving marriage, acknowledging that the Brewers, like any couple, harbored their secrets and challenges. He contended that the police, under pressure to resolve a high-profile case, had unfairly fixated on his client, a grieving, traumatized woman, and had distorted the evidence to fit their preconceived narrative. He insisted that Hannah was as much a victim as Matthew, her life shattered first by an unknown assailant and now by a relentless and misguided prosecution. He concluded by informing the jury that, by the trial's end, they would realize the true perpetrator remained at large and that they were attempting to convict the wrong person. The contrast between the two opening statements could not have been more pronounced. The prosecution had presented a narrative of cold, calculated treachery, grounded in the emotional reality of the victim's own words. The defense had offered a story of mystery and police ineptitude, a classic maneuver to sow reasonable doubt by obscuring the facts and impugning the investigation. The jury was left to ponder these two conflicting realities, to determine which narrative the evidence would ultimately corroborate. As the court adjourned for the day, the image of Matthew Brewer's smiling face remained indelibly imprinted in the minds of everyone in the room. Victoria Ramos had successfully shifted the focus from the defendant's performance of grief to the victim's stolen life, rendering his absence a potent, palpable force. Hannah Brewer had aspired to be the star of her own trial, but on the very first day, she had been upstaged by the ghost of the man she had failed to kill. The battle for justice had commenced, and its initial strike had been delivered with the heartbreaking, undeniable truth of a home video. The prosecution's case against Hannah Brewer unfolded with methodical, devastating precision, each piece of evidence building upon the last to construct an irrefutable bulwark of guilt. They began with the testimonies of first responders and detectives who described the pristine crime scene, the absence of forced entry, and the defendant's strangely composed demeanor in the hours following the attack. Next came the financial experts, who guided the jury through the mountain of debt, the secret credit cards, and the forged loan documents, starkly exposing the clear, desperate motive of greed that underlay the entire brutal affair. The jury witnessed a woman not consumed by passion, but ensnared by a self-created financial crisis, who viewed her husband's life as the sole available bailout. The prosecution's core emotional appeal resonated deeply, primarily stemming from the heart-wrenching testimonies of Matthew's family and friends. They tearfully depicted his profound devotion to Hannah and his utter ignorance of her treachery. His mother, Eleanor Foster, movingly recounted Matthew's enthusiastic call on their anniversary, brimming with excitement about his planned surprise. His voice, she recalled, was filled with love for the woman who, unbeknownst to him, was at that very moment meticulously orchestrating the end of his life. These narratives humanized Matthew, transforming him from a mere name on a legal document into a vibrant individual whose tragically curtailed future became the trial's central sadness. With each successive witness, the image of Hannah as an affectionate wife progressively deteriorated, replaced by the chilling portrayal of a calculating and deceitful aggressor. However, a mid-trial revelation emerged from a place Hannah had presumed impervious, the perceived sanctity of her own computer. The prosecution introduced a digital forensics expert who meticulously unearthed the digital remnants of Hannah's sinister deliberations from her laptop's hard drive. The expert's testimony revealed a chilling narrative of premeditation through the defendant's internet search history in the weeks preceding the assault. A profound silence enveloped the courtroom as he articulated the searches, simultaneously displaying them on large screens for the jury's scrutiny, each entry offering a disturbing glimpse into her malevolent intent. The list proved unequivocally damning and hair-raising. Life insurance payout rules for spouse read one search query dated 6 weeks before the attack. Easiest way to fake a home invasion appeared a month prior. As the attack date drew nearer, the searches became increasingly explicit and macabre. How to incapacitate a person quickly and quietly, best place to strike for maximum damage, and, most horrifically, how long does it take to die from blunt force trauma? The jury gazed at the screen, their faces a melange of shock and repugnance, as they absorbed the cold, calculated inquiries of a killer meticulously planning her crime. The final search unveiled by the expert was from the very morning of their 15th anniversary, merely hours before Matthew was to return home to his surprise dinner and his wife's brutal ambush. The search query was stark, clinical, and utterly monstrous. How to clean blood out of wood flooring. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom gallery. This single search, more powerfully than any financial record or witness testimony, obliterated any lingering notion that the attack was a spontaneous act or the work of an unknown intruder. It served as the digital blueprint of a murder, the dispassionate to-do list of a woman more preoccupied with post-crime cleanup than with the life she was about to extinguish. Hannah's reaction was a study in collapsing composure as the searches were recited, her face paled, blood draining from it, and her hands, resting on the defense table, began to tremble uncontrollably. Her facade of quiet sorrow crumbled, replaced by the raw, panicked expression of a trapped creature. She cast a desperate, enraged glance at her lawyer, as if he possessed the power to erase the words from the screen. Yet, the evidence was incontrovertible, a digital echo of her own thoughts that she could not evade. Her meticulously constructed persona had been utterly annihilated by her own curiosity. The impact on the jury was immediate and profound. They had witnessed the joyful, smiling Matthew in the home video, and now they confronted the cold, calculating research of the woman who had betrayed him. The juxtaposition was sickening, creating a clear and indisputable narrative of a predator and her victim. Any flicker of sympathy they might have harbored for the tearful teacher at the defense table dissipated, replaced by a chilling certainty. They were not observing a victim. They were looking at a monster who had utilized Google to orchestrate the destruction of her own family. When court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere felt heavy with the gravity of the digital evidence. The prosecution had not merely presented a motive. They had presented a confession, a step-by-step guide to the crime, authored by the defendant herself. The question was no longer whether Hannah Brewer had assaulted her husband, but rather how anyone could have ever credited her innocence in the initial place. The killer's search history had emerged as the prosecution's most compelling witness. A silent, irrefutable voice from the machine that articulated nothing but the truth. Facing a case rapidly disintegrating under the weight of the prosecution's digital evidence, defense attorney Stephen Carlson recognized the imperative for a bold risk. His strategy pivoted from cultivating reasonable doubt about an intruder to challenging the established timeline and weaving an alternative narrative, one in which Hannah, though deceptive financially, was innocent of violent assault. The bedrock of this revised strategy rested on a surprise witness, Sarah Miller, a close friend of Hannah's, poised to testify that she had been on the phone with Hannah precisely when the prosecution alleged the attack occurred, thereby providing a crucial alibi. Sarah Miller, a nervous yet resolute woman who clearly championed her friend's innocence, took the stand. She testified that she and Hannah conversed almost every evening, and that on the anniversary night, they engaged in a lengthy discussion commencing around 10 and continuing for nearly 45 minutes. She meticulously recounted details of their conversation, touching upon school, their children, and upcoming summer plans. Carlson skillfully guided her testimony, establishing a clear, uninterrupted window during which Hannah could not possibly have been attacking her husband. For the first time since the trial's inception, a glimmer of doubt seemed to permeate the courtroom. During her cross-examination, prosecutor Victoria Ramos maintained a calm and methodical demeanor, pressing Sarah to verify the specifics of the call, its commencement time, and the subjects discussed. Sarah's account remained consistent, solidifying her appearance as a credible and compelling witness for the defense. Hannah, for her part, observed the exchange with renewed confidence, a faint, hopeful smile gracing her lips. It seemed her lawyer had finally exposed a chink in the prosecution's seemingly impenetrable case. The alibi was formidable, emanating from a witness with no apparent motive to prevaricate. Then, in a moment of pure courtroom drama, the defense's narrative imploded spectacularly. As Sarah Miller confidently reiterated that her call with Hannah concluded at approximately 10:45, Victoria Ramos paused, glanced at her phone, and then back at the witness. "Ma'am, are you absolutely certain about that timeline?" Ramos inquired, her voice steady. Sarah confirmed her certainty. At that precise moment, a bailiff approached the prosecution's table and handed Ramos a small folded note. She scanned it, her expression unreadable, then addressed the judge. "Your Honor," she declared, her voice imbued with newfound authority, "the prosecution has just received new evidence directly pertaining to this witness's testimony." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the judge granted Ramos permission to proceed. She turned back to Sarah Miller, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "Miss Miller, you testified that you were on the phone with the defendant until 10:45 p.m. Is that correct?" Sarah nodded. Ramos then unveiled the source of the new evidence. A text message sent merely minutes prior to the lead detective on the case from Hannah's secret lover, who, having followed the trial in the news and fearing implication, had finally resolved to cooperate fully with the prosecution. He had furnished them with the complete call and text logs from Hannah's burner phone, exclusively used for their illicit affair. Ramos projected the call log from the burner phone onto the courtroom screens. It displayed a single damning entry, an outgoing call to Sarah Miller's number that night, but it had lasted only 3 minutes, terminating promptly at 10:03 p.m. What followed was a series of text messages between Hannah and her lover, commencing at 10:05 p.m. and continuing for the remainder of the hour. On the screen, in stark black and white for the entire jury to witness, was a text from Hannah sent at 10:47 p.m., the exact time the attack was believed to have transpired. The message was chilling. "It's almost time. I'll call you when it's done. I love you." The courtroom fell into an absolute hush. Sarah Miller stared at the screen, her face ashen as the reality of her friend's manipulation washed over her. She had been a mere pawn in Hannah's game, her trust exploited to fabricate a false alibi for an attempted murder. Stephen Carlson, his face grim, slumped at the defense table, his surprise witness and entire strategy utterly decimated in a single dramatic instant. The lie was not merely exposed, it was annihilated in real time by a piece of surprise evidence that no one, least of all the defendant, had anticipated. Hannah Brewer's reaction was no longer one of confident hope, but of pure, unrestrained rage. She glared at the image on the screen, then at her friend on the witness stand, her eyes burning with a terrifying hatred. The mask was gone, not merely fractured, but utterly obliterated, revealing the raging, manipulative monster beneath. The jury observed her, their expressions a mix of horror and cold realization. They had just witnessed the defense's case being dismantled by the defendant's own words, a digital bombshell that had detonated in the midst of the trial, leaving nothing but the ugly truth in its wake. With the defense's case in tatters and Hannah Brewer's guilt all but confirmed, the trial progressed to its final, most emotionally charged phase, the victim impact statements. Though Matthew had survived, the crime had irrevocably shattered his family, and the court permitted his loved ones to articulate the profound and devastating impact of Hannah's actions. The courtroom buzzed with an unspoken tension, a palpable shift in focus as the human cost of the crime finally emerged, starkly contrasting the sterile legal arguments that had thus far dominated the proceedings. The spotlight swiveled away from the perpetrator, illuminating instead the lives she had so carelessly shattered. Matthew's friends and colleagues painted a vibrant portrait of the man they cherished, emphasizing how the trauma he endured had snuffed out his innate brilliance. They recounted the agonizing weeks he spent in a coma, the arduous physical recovery, and the profound, invisible wounds of betrayal that threatened to remain unhealed. Their poignant narratives sketched a harrowing image of a life tragically cut short, a future ruthlessly stolen, and a trust so utterly violated that it had irrevocably altered the very essence of the man they held dear. The jury, captivated, listened with a growing sense of sympathy and a simmering indignation directed at the woman seated at the defense table. Then came the moment that silenced the entire courtroom, bringing tears to even the most stoic observers. Eleanor Foster, Matthew's mother, took the stand. A woman of incredible grace and dignity, her face embodied every parent's worst nightmare. Her testimony was not about her own suffering, but about the anguish inflicted upon her 7-year-old grandson Leo, who had been innocently sleeping upstairs as his mother attempted to murder his father downstairs. She described the bewilderment and terror reflected in her grandson's eyes, a child who had tragically lost both parents in a single night, one to a savage act of violence, and the other to an evil beyond his youthful comprehension. In a profound act of love and defiance, Eleanor then turned from the judge and jury, her gaze locking directly onto Leo, who sat in the front row between his aunt and uncle. Her voice, thick with emotion yet unwavering, resonated through the silent courtroom. "Leo," she began, her words a sacred vow, "I know you're scared, and I know you miss your daddy, but I promise you, my sweet boy, I promise you that the monster who hurt him will not hurt anyone ever again. We will be safe, and justice will be done." This was a grandmother's solemn pledge to her grandson, a declaration of war against the malevolence that had invaded their lives. Hannah Brewer, who until this point had maintained an air of bored indifference, reacted to Eleanor's heartfelt words with a stunning display of contempt. As the heartbroken grandmother spoke directly to her traumatized grandchild, a small, cruel smile flickered across Hannah's lips, followed by a short, sharp sigh of theatrical exasperation. It was a minuscule gesture, yet in the emotionally charged atmosphere of the courtroom, it resounded like a gunshot. It was an unmistakable declaration of her utter lack of remorse, her disdain for the family she had shattered, and her chilling sociopathic inability to feel anything for the child she had betrayed. The jury saw it. The judge saw it. Every single person in the courtroom witnessed that fleeting amusement, that dismissive sigh. It was a moment of unadulterated evil, a chilling glimpse into a soul so devoid of empathy that the sight of a grandmother comforting a terrified child was nothing more than an irritant. Any last vestige of doubt, any lingering spark of sympathy for the woman in the pale blue sweater was extinguished in that single, horrifying instant. Her mask had not merely slipped, she had deliberately ripped it off and trampled it underfoot. Eleanor Foster concluded her statement, her promise hanging in the air, a testament to love's enduring power in the face of unspeakable darkness. As she stepped down, her gaze remained fixed on her grandson, the innocent victim caught in the wreckage of his mother's monstrous selfishness. The breaking point arrived not through a dramatic confession or a piece of physical evidence, but through a grandmother's promise and a sociopath's smirk, a devastating juxtaposition that sealed Hannah Brewer's fate more definitively than any legal argument ever could. The prosecution rested its case. There was nothing more to add. The evidence pertaining to the crime was overwhelming, but it was the defendant's character, exposed in that one fleeting, contemptuous expression, that truly condemned her. It revealed to the jury not just what she had done, but who she was, a monster lurking in plain sight, a woman to whom concepts like love, family, and remorse were utterly alien. Justice for Matthew and Leo Brewer now lay in the hands of the jury, and there was little doubt about their impending verdict. Just when it seemed the trial could hold no further surprises, Victoria Ramos rose and informed the judge of the state's intention to call one final, unannounced rebuttal witness. A wave of confusion and anticipation swept through the courtroom. The prosecution's case was already overwhelmingly strong, making the purpose of this last-minute addition a mystery to everyone, including a visibly perplexed defense team. The judge granted the request, and the clerk uttered the name that would deliver the trial's ultimate shocking twist. The state calls Matthew Brewer to the stand. The courtroom doors opened, and a collective, audible gasp filled the room. Slowly but steadily, precisely towards the witness stand, walked Matthew Brewer himself, his face bearing scars but his eyes clear and resolute. His survival had been a closely guarded secret, known only to prosecutors, doctors, and his immediate family. A strategic decision made to prevent Hannah from molding her defense around his existence. For weeks, she and her legal team had operated under the firm conviction that they were battling a circumstantial murder case, not one involving a living, breathing victim who could speak the truth. Hannah Brewer's reaction was a spectacle of pure, unadulterated shock. Her jaw dropped, her eyes widened in disbelief, and all color drained from her face, leaving her with a ghastly pale complexion. This was the one variable she had never foreseen, the one loose end she was certain she had meticulously tied. The man she had abandoned for dead, the central phantom of the entire trial, was now walking towards her, a living testament to her failure and her wickedness. Her arrogant composure, her meticulously crafted lies, her entire world dissolved into a puddle of primal fear in the face of the man who had inexplicably survived her. Matthew took the stand, his gaze never once wavering from the woman who had been his wife. When the prosecutor asked him to identify his attacker, he raised a slightly trembling hand and pointed directly at Hannah. "She did this to me," he declared, his voice raspy but strong, a voice the courtroom had previously only heard on a joyous home video. "My wife, Hannah Brewer, tried to kill me." The words hung heavy in the air, an irrefutable accusation from the one person whose testimony could nullify all doubt, all legal maneuvering, and all defense strategies. With quiet, heartbreaking dignity, Matthew recounted the events of their anniversary night. He described the surprise dinner, the locket, and the last happy moments he had shared with the woman he loved. Then, his voice hardening, he detailed the brutal, unprovoked attack from behind, the searing pain, and the chillingly calm and determined look in Hannah's eyes as she stood over him, ensuring he was no longer moving before abandoning him to die. He spoke of waking up in the hospital, weeks later, to a world utterly shattered, his wife arrested for his murder, and his son entrusted to his grandparents' care. It was the testimony of a man who had walked through hell and returned to tell the tale. But the final revelation, the ultimate twist in a trial full of them, came when Ramos asked Matthew about a discovery made by his family while cleaning out the couple's home. He explained that they had found a hidden compartment in Hannah's closet containing not just her secret credit cards and a burner phone, but a complete set of expertly forged identity documents, a driver's license, a social security card, and a passport, all bearing Hannah's picture, but under a completely different name, Amelia Finch. There were also bank statements for an account under that fictitious name in a different state, an account she had been slowly funding with money stolen from him. the truth was finally unveiled in all its monstrous scope. Hannah's plan was never merely to leave Matthew for her lover, it was to vanish entirely. She intended to collect the $500,000 life insurance payout, abandon her lover, abandon her son, and disappear to start a new life as Amelia Finch, a wealthy, unencumbered woman with no ties to the past. The murder of her husband was simply the seed money for her complete reinvention, and her own child was just another piece of baggage she intended to discard. It was a level of selfish, narcissistic cruelty that was almost impossible to fathom. The jury stared at Hannah, their faces masks of pure revulsion. She was not merely a would-be murderer and a thief. She was a woman willing to erase her own child from her life with the same casualness with which she would change her name. This final revelation had exposed the true depth of her depravity, a bottomless pit of self-interest that knew no bounds. She had not only attempted to kill her husband, but had also planned to effectively kill herself, murdering the identity of Hannah Brewer, devoted mother and wife, to give birth to a phantom. As Matthew Brewer concluded his testimony, a profound and heavy silence settled over the courtroom. There were no more questions to be asked, no more evidence to be presented. The living victim had spoken, and in doing so, he had not only identified his attacker, but had also laid bare the full, horrifying extent of her monstrous plan. Justice was no longer a matter of legal debate. It was a moral certainty. The final nail had been hammered into Hannah Brewer's coffin, delivered by the very man she had tried to put in one. The jury's deliberation proved a mere formality, a fleeting interval preceding the unavoidable conclusion. They re-emerged within the hour, their countenances set and stern, delivering a verdict with an unambiguous clarity that mirrored the feelings of everyone who had witnessed the proceedings. Guilty on all counts, the foreman declared, attempted murder, aggravated assault, and multiple counts of fraud. Hannah Brewer, who had once been so entirely convinced of her own shrewdness, maintained an impassive expression as the verdict was read. Her face evinced not a hint of contrition or apprehension, but rather a cold, fierce indignation at being outmaneuvered. Weeks later, at the sentencing hearing, the legal drama's final act unfolded. Matthew's family presented their concluding impact statements, speaking not with rage, but of the extensive path to recovery that lay ahead for both Matthew and his son, Leo. Matthew himself submitted a written statement, which Victoria Ramos read aloud. In it, he referenced the apparition of the woman he had once loved and expressed his hope that she would be permanently prevented from ever harming another individual. This was a statement imbued with quiet fortitude and profound sorrow, a dignified, ultimate farewell to the 14 years of his life that had been constructed upon a falsehood. When the judge extended the opportunity for Hannah to speak, she rose, her posture rigid and defiant. Her lawyer, Stephen Carlson, subtly shook his head, his eyes imploring her to remain silent. Yet, Hannah's hubris could not be contained. She offered neither apology nor plea for mercy. Instead, she delivered a chilling, self-pitying address, portraying herself as the true victim, a woman misunderstood and persecuted by a vindictive system and an ungrateful husband. Not a shred of remorse for her actions was evident. Her words were a final, desperate performance for an audience that had long ceased to believe her. The judge, a man renowned for his stoic and impartial temperament, listened to Hannah's diatribe with barely concealed disgust. When she concluded, he did not erupt into a tirade or a lecture. Instead, he fixed his gaze directly upon her, his voice low and unwavering, and delivered a sentence that served as both a legal judgment and a moral condemnation. He spoke of the profound malevolence of her deeds, her calculated cruelty, and the terrifying emptiness where her conscience ought to have resided. He sentenced her to the maximum possible term, life in prison with no chance of parole for 40 years, guaranteeing that she would reach old age before ever experiencing freedom again. As the severe sentence was pronounced, the courtroom remained hushed. A collective sigh of relief seemed to sweep through the gallery. The protracted, agonizing ordeal was finally complete. Justice, hard-won and desperately necessary, had been served. But as the bailiffs prepared to escort her from the courtroom for the very last time, Hannah Brewer offered one final act of defiance, one ultimate message of contempt for the family she had sought to obliterate. She turned her head, her eyes first locking with Matthew, then with his mother, Eleanor. The guise of the victim, the teacher, the wife had vanished forever, leaving behind pure, unadulterated evil, A slow, terrifying smirk spread across her lips, a silent, chilling expression of triumph and unrepentant hatred. It was a look that conveyed no regrets, no remorse, and that even in her defeat, she still believed she had prevailed. The smirk was her final defiant gesture, a horrifying glimpse into the abyssal blackness of her soul, a last poisonous gift to the family she had failed to shatter. Then she turned and was led away, her smirk disappearing behind the courtroom doors, leaving in its wake a legacy of pain and a chilling memory that would forever haunt them.